Hello and welcome. I'm Matt Slawson. I'm the owner of Paradise Asphalt. I also consult with Next Level Contractor. My good friend Todd Eichholz, he owns A Paving in Chicago. Today we want to talk to you about the new generation of future owners. That can mean a lot of things, but for Todd and I, it meant purchasing the businesses we were at. So I worked at the company I was with for several years, and then I purchased that business. Todd owned a portion of that business and then bought it outright. So today we want to talk about how you maximize the value of your company, whether you own it or you're just a team member, and then explore the options to transition. So again, we both purchased companies. I've consulted on numerous deals, typically external sales, not internal sales. So the content you're going to hear today is from two guys that have been through the process. It's not something we read books on. We've lived it. A lot of what we're going to talk about are actually things we learned after the fact, the hard way. Because we all make some mistakes along the way, and hopefully we can help you prevent those mistakes. Quick note from Todd.
So if you rewind to NPE of 2020, I was getting on a plane. I got a call from my mother. I probably got rushed to the hospital. Something's not right. And literally landed in Nashville, got a call that we needed to come home. Jumped back on a plane. I was in Nashville for 8 minutes. Flew back, found a bad tumor, and ended up passing away just before Thanksgiving. So the reason why I'm telling you that is the times that Matt and I planned to build out the book, we missed the deadline. So we put together the book. This is going to be slightly different. We spent a lot of time in January permitting and changing it. So if the book doesn't match this, I just want to let you guys know that. Come see us. Give me your email. We've got a thing you can check with us on LinkedIn. I will email you this entire thing. So if it's a little confusing in the beginning, it doesn't match 100%, just ask for a little bit of grace. Maybe from time we missed the deadline for what we created.
Thanks, Todd. So again, I know what it's like to be flipping through the book, doesn't match the screen. Bear with us. So the big idea I want you guys to take away today is to realize how to buy or sell a business. And more importantly, in doing that, you got to figure out where you're at and where you want to go. You got to create a plan, and you have to execute that plan to actually get there. So how we do that? First, we're going to identify what stage your business is in. You can't get anywhere unless you know where you're starting from, right? When you booked a flight to come to Charlotte, maybe you drove, you started from somewhere. You don't just put in Charlotte. You got to know where you start from. So we're going to talk about the stages of business, and you're going to learn where your business is at. Then Todd and I are going to cover the transition process. And that transition process looks different if it's an internal transition or if it's an external transition. But we'll talk about both and walk through the stages of that transition. Then Todd's going to share some of the best practices on how to maximize the value of your company. No one wants to transition or sell their company unless it's at peak value. There's no point. You want to get as much out of it as you can get. After that, we're going to summarize some of the lessons we've learned, the key takeaways, the mistakes we made, and the things we would probably change if we could do it over. So with this in mind, this class is really built for three groups of people. It's built for those that own a business and want to sell that business, whether it be in the next 2 years or the next 10 years. It's also built for those that maybe want to buy a business. It might be the business that you're at, it might be a different business, it might be starting a business. But this will give you insights to that. Then as Todd and I were talking, we were like, what about the third group of people? There's probably a lot of you in this room that don't own a business. Maybe you don't want to own a business. But the content we covered here today is going to help you contribute to the company you're at. And it's not really a secret, but maybe it is. If you maximize the value of the company that you're at, you're maximizing your value. And if you maximize your value, you're a key employee. And when you're a key employee, you're going to get paid more. And if they ever do transition, you're going to get paid more at that point too. Because at the end of the day, That's what people buy when they buy companies. So before I turn it over to Todd, I just got a few questions. I know a lot of you guys send these classes, don't always like to raise your hand or interact, but I'm going to ask them anyway. How many people in here own their own business? I know a few of you do. Okay. How many of you are looking, same group of people, maybe looking to sell your business in the next 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe sooner? Few hands, okay. How many of you that maybe don't own a business, maybe you own one, you're interested in buying another one? That happens too, right? It's common to tuck in, so there's a couple hands. Excellent. Then how many are just either currently a key team member or want to become a key team member? Okay. No, that helps us, and I appreciate the feedback, because as we get that feedback, we know where you guys are at, and we'll be able to better speak to those points.
So we're going to talk about two very different outcomes in the way a transition or a sale can happen. And as we go through these, one is much more common in our industry than the other. So we're going to start with the typical story, and we've got countless number of deals that have gone this way, where the owner thought he was ready to sell, thought he was ready to transition. You start making your plans, you start doing what you're going to do in retirement, and then you start going through the evaluation process, you start going through some other things, you realize either you weren't ready or it's not worth what you thought it was worth the whole entire time. So 3 quick stories of this identical company A, concrete company we were working with, wanted to transition, family owned, sons want to take it, sons aren't sure if they want to take it, if they can buy it, they want to bring in a partner. The biggest issue they had was the father was so key to the business. He operated some of the machines, he was their estimator, he was their project manager, the wife was the accountant. They were so ingrained in this business that if you pulled them out, you had to replace them with 5 employees. So while they were making a ton of cash, great house, new cars, they had everything they could want. The business wasn't worth anything that they thought it was because they were the business. You take that father out, you take that mother out, they have nothing to sell. All they had is 2 sons that were pretty decent. They didn't learn how to run the business, but there was nothing for them to then take over. Very similar to the seal coating company we were working with. Again, the father was so crucial to the business that if you pulled him out, there was nothing to sell. You're basically getting a company that does 300,000 gallons a year. You're getting a couple of really good key team members on the crew. But as far as the leadership to run those crews, project managers to run those, or anyone else in the office to where the owner can pull one of these and someone else can just step in, it's impossible. The amount of hiring that would need to happen to replace that key person completely devalue the company. Because now you're picking up project managers, you're picking up estimators, you're picking up salespeople. They're going to spend $300,000-$400,000 in salaries to replace that one person. And then you have to train all those people. For the key team members in here, there's a roofing company we were working with where, same story, very, very, very key to the business, tried to sell it, went through some venture capital firms, went to some competitors, and they all said the same thing, that what are we buying? There's nothing to take over if you leave. So in his mind, he was going to put together a plan. He went and hired a sales manager, production manager, and an office manager, and said, if you guys stay, I'm going to give you each 5% of the business. I'll carve out that and give that to you if you stay during the transition. He wanted out, didn't know how to plan and maximize the value. He just wanted out. So he hired people, a $12 million company. He gave away 15% so that he could get out because he didn't know how to plan for the future. He gave away $1.8 million of value because he thought that was the best way to plan, and it's absolutely not. So, as we go through this, what is that? The key thing for that company is, again, they're successful making money. They think life is great. They hadn't planned for the future. They had no leadership team, and the owner was too key to the business. So, as you're thinking about transitioning, you've got to start thinking, how crucial are you to the business? If you disappeared for a couple of months, what would happen? If you're going to eventually transition to the kids, or if you're going to sell the business, what are they actually buying? And this class is going to talk about how the ideal story of how to do that, how to build these things in place so that you can exit the business, sell it for the maximum value, or transition to the kids. So other issues with those companies is there were lots of financial admins. And what those are is, I'm sure we run personal cars, personal money through the business, maybe your wife's taking a salary but she doesn't work there. You have to defend all those things when your expenses come. You're going to say, I'm going to take that out. There's a lot of work that gets very, very messy if you're not working on your financials and trying to build several years of very clean financials and not just trying to get as many deductions as you can through the business. So these same businesses lack systems and processes. Same person that ran the crew was the head salesman, he was the project manager, ran everything. They could not scale. So they had nothing to sell. There was no scalability beyond keeping that. So it took hundreds and hundreds of hours to get some of these companies in shape so that they could sell for the maximum value. On the flip side, the ideal story is you're successful, you're growing, but you're building an organization, you're not building a business. You need to lead from the top down and actually delegate so that if you were to step away, your business can survive without you. So the companies that we work with that got 95% of the value of what they thought it was worth, they have strong leadership team. The owner was not heavily reliant, he was leading, not managing. They utilized technology, they had processes, they had systems, and they were scaling, and they were able to have proven scalability that they could defend to their potential buyers. They also started cleaning up their financials well before they ever thought about transitioning or selling. So they're pulling out extra deductions that you're trying to write off. They're pulling off your wife's car, maybe you ran a boat through your company, whatever it is. They're pulling all that out to make it as profitable as possible. Yes, you're going to pay more taxes, but you're building that value to show the company is extremely profitable, growing in this scale. A lot of times, these guys did not figure this out on their own. They partnered with advisors, they partnered with CPAs, they partnered with consultants, people that can advise them and bring maximum value, and all the money that you're going to invest with those people will pay 10 times what you paid them by cleaning up the business to get ready to transition.
Thanks, Todd. So hopefully you guys see the importance of what we're going to cover. The difference can be truly millions of dollars, right? So it's important to understand it. Also, it's important to put the other, if you're the seller, put your buyer hat on and think about, well, if I were buying this, would I pay more or less based on some of those things Todd just covered? Before we dive into the actual transition process itself, I just want to talk a little bit more about identifying where you're starting, what stage your business is actually in. So here we have the 5 stages of business. I think there is a slide here. It looks like it's going to print pretty small in your handout. Again, Todd and I will be happy to send you a PDF of this whole deck. The 5 stages of business is not something that Todd or I created. It was actually the Harvard Business Review. But it applies, and I'm not going to walk through all of this, but I want you guys to start to look at what stage you might be in and what types of crisis can hit you at various stages. So the first stage you see here is that existence stage. And that existence stage is the startup companies, right? It's the guy that's entrepreneurial, maybe he started seal coating driveways, and he had an idea. Maybe he had an idea on the marketing side, and he's like, you know, there's an underserved market on ADA. So in my geographic location, I'm going to hit ADA really hard. He has a business idea. That's the existence stage. The challenge with the existence stage is that guy that has that idea may not be able to structure or actually grow a business, right? You might be really good at putting the sealer down. You don't know how you're going to sell. Maybe you're really good at sales, but you have no idea how to put it down, right? So you've got a couple of options there. You either educate yourself by coming to shows like this and learning the best practices, or you find somebody that complements you. You find that sales director. You find that operations manager. That being said, I'm going to guess that most of you are kind of past this existence stage. There might be a couple, but typically you're going to be in that second or third stage as we look at this. The second stage is the survival stage. And here there is a different type of crisis. When you're in the survival stage, you're growing a little bit, you might be a couple years in, but the owner is still very involved, and nobody quite knows who's responsible for what, right? So when you don't know where your responsibilities end, you go to the owner. I'm sure none of you that own a business have ever felt like everybody's knocking at your door or bringing you their problems and putting them on your desk, right? That never happens. The reality is you have to start to delegate and remove that bottleneck and build the accountability and the responsibilities for your team members if you want to grow to that success stage. And this survival stage, I've worked with companies that stay in this survival stage for years before ever finding that success stage. I've worked with other companies that get right through it and they're right into the success stage. So on that, the success stage, a lot of people that I go through this slide with, they're like, Matt, that should be the end. There shouldn't be any more stages, right? Like, we've succeeded. And I would say, yeah, most of the time it is the end. So for a lot of companies that I work with, they don't move past stage 3. I was talking to a gentleman this morning, and he even said, I'm happy, I'm content. I've had this business for a while. We're profitable, we're making money. I don't have the drive maybe that I used to have, right? And so what happens is you kind of live in the success stage. I tend to call it a lifestyle business, because like Todd says, you can get the boat, you can take your vacations, you kind of got it dialed in. The challenge here is if you want to grow, you have to reinvest. And there's risk to that reinvestment. Because again, most of us are pretty content. So it's not uncommon for businesses to actually exit when they're in stage 3. You don't have to get to stage 5, and most don't before they transition. The next stage is a very significant one, and I would call it kind of a volatile stage. And the reason it's volatile is it's the takeoff stage. And as I already mentioned, you've got to invest a lot of time. You have to invest a lot of capital, and it doesn't always mean you hit the next stage of resource maturity. A lot of people think, well, if I get to the takeoff stage, I either go back to success or I reach resource maturity. That's not true. A lot of companies hit the takeoff stage thinking they can reach stage 5, only to slide all the way back to stage 2. And the reason that is because you can over leverage yourself. You can put yourself in a position where it just doesn't work. And the crisis that you see in this stage is typically as you move through that success stage, you figured out how to delegate, right? You've got the team, you've got that leadership team that Todd mentioned. You've brought in the systems, the processes. I know a few of you were in my job costing class yesterday. Got job costing dialed in. Maybe you brought on a project coordinator. So now your sales reps, they sell a job. They used to schedule that job, right? I'm sure we've all walked it all the way through. You played a little bit of sales, a little bit of project management. Well, not anymore, because you're trying to build a scalable company. But that can backfire because it creates tension. It creates tension for the guys that were with you in the survival stage, because they're not used to handing that job off to the project coordinator. They're used to talking to their customer. And candidly, if you don't do it well, your customers are going to experience some frustration. What's up with all this bureaucracy? Why do I got to talk to so-and-so to get my job scheduled, and so-and-so to get a question on the billing? I just want one point of contact. So if you're going to take this stage on, be careful and make sure you do it well, and make sure you're in a position where you want to move past that lifestyle business. Because there's nothing wrong with maintaining stage 3. And you can grow in stage 3. But to reach stage 5, which is resource maturity, you've got to go through the takeoff stage. So resource maturity is that stage that, the companies that first come to mind are the Starbucks downstairs, McDonald's, Nike. These are your big companies. And I'll be honest, guys, I work with a lot of people in the pavement maintenance space. There's only a handful of companies that have really hit this stage. Because again, it takes a lot, and most stay in stage 3. When you reach resource maturity, the things that come at you, the crises, as this slide says, vary greatly. Because now you're susceptible to strategic decisions. You know, maybe you decide not to go a direction and your competitor decides to take that direction. So your competitor now becomes your crisis. You're typically big enough now that environmental regulations. I work with companies out in California. There's all sorts of regulations they have to work through just to stay in business. There's a lot of different crises that can come at you in this resource maturity stage. But it's a great stage to be in because, again, much like the success stage, your cash is far more steady. In stages 2 and 4, your cash is not going to be quite so steady. So as you think about these stages, I want us to look at 3 main components. There's the management style, there's the strategic focus, and there's systems and processes. And I know some of you in the back, it might be a little hard to read this, but if you can, just look through each of those and take a moment on the management style. Let's start with management style and think about how are you managing your company? Does everything flow through the owner? Is the owner now more of an administrator, maybe not touching everything, but you're still involved in scheduling all the jobs, you're maybe still reviewing the bids? Or have you moved to stage 3, which is what I call functional management? Functional is much like it sounds, right? You have a sales department, ideally you have a sales manager like Todd, his company. You have a director of operations, you have a marketing, you have a finance, you have functional management. Then eventually in the takeoff stage, you're talking about divisional management. And that division can be divided by service line. So you might have seal coat managers, seal coat sales, seal coat project managers, and then you've got paving and crack fill, or it may not be by service line. It's also common to see companies as they grow do it by geography. I know a company I work with, they've got an office in Michigan, one in South Carolina, they've kind of got them spread out. So now you've got to have teams in different geographical locations. And then line staff is, again, that resource maturity. Typically with line staff, you're going to see a lot of layers, right? You're going to have managers and pump managers. But take a minute and just kind of think through where you're at in terms of management style. Next, we have strategic focus. Strategic focus is different, obviously, than management. You could be in a different stage depending on the area. So with strategic focus, you really want to think about cash flow because it has a lot to do with cash flow. You're either focused on maintaining your cash, making sure you can make payroll, talk to your bank about that line of credit, or maybe you've reached that success stage and you're sitting on a healthy amount, you're not pulling your line like you used to. And possibly in that success stage, you're starting to reinvest. Maybe you're not jumping into the full takeoff stage, but you're adding a mill to your fleet. You're adding a second paver. Maybe you're buying that fancy robotic crack fill machine, right? You're probably in stage 5 if you're doing that. But think about cash flow. Think about where you're at, what stage you're in as it relates to your cash flow and your strategic focus. How much focus do you spend on capital? And finally, for the third row here, we've got our systems and processes. So again, your existence stage, it's going to be very ad hoc. There's not going to be much of a process, right? It's going to be the owner looking at that driveway, thinking, I can do that in 4 hours, I'll put this much on it. And you go sell it, and you do it yourself. And that's that existence stage. In the survival stage, you're starting to build it out, right? Much like I talked about yesterday in job costing. You're looking at your Excel sheets, you're starting to track what your labor costs are, you're building a way to bid, make your bids a little more efficient. Then you hit that stage 3, and at stage 3, you're probably beginning to utilize some systems, some processes. They may still need refined a bit. Maybe you're not fully utilizing the system, but you're using half of it. Take off stage, you're going to have to refine those systems. It's the only way to scale. Then again, stage 5, I talked a little bit about ERP systems, but those are going to be your Sage 300, Acumatica, some of those that's going to kind of integrate your accounting to your operations. And like I'm going to assume most of us in here probably aren't at that place, but think about, kind of rate yourself on the systems. And then once you're done, kind of average out which stage you're in, so you've got an idea of where you're starting from. So I know we're covering a lot of these stages, and we'll quickly move into the process that Todd was talking about. I just wanted to take a quick minute and illustrate how cash is impacted. So I talked about it a little bit on the last slide, but you can see by this chart, it is critical to success in stages 1 and 2. If you don't have cash, you're probably not going to be in the business very long. In stage 3, cash is still very important. Don't mistake this y-axis for importance. What this says, it's now a byproduct. You're doing the right things. You've honed your pricing and your systems. So now cash isn't quite as critical, and that's because you have it. But as I mentioned, most people don't take the journey for stage 4 because cash becomes of the utmost importance because you're putting it back in. So this kind of helps you see why people can slide all the way back to stage 2, or they may get to stage 5, and it feels a lot more like stage 3. Another metric as you think about the stages and trying to figure out where you're at, it's the owner's ability to execute versus his ability to delegate. So as we know, you don't get through that existence stage if you can't execute. Most of you that raised your hand earlier, you've been out there, you've been with the guys, you've worked alongside them, you've ran the bids, you've scoped the lots. But as you reach that success stage, and I will almost back this up a little bit, but you can see it start to trail off. You've got to learn to delegate. That's probably the hardest thing. It was hard for me. I think it was challenging for you. I work with a lot of owners that are still involved. I mean, I'm talking one guy out in California, north of $20-25 million company, and he's still like orders office supplies. What are you doing? You've been ordering office supplies. You've got a team of people. You've got to start to let go. You've got to focus on the things that will actually help you grow your business. To get through the takeoff stage, delegation is going to be key. And again, this may be another reason for a lot of us that have done it for a while. Some of the guys that have been in this business for 30 plus years, it's hard to teach an old new tricks, right? It's hard to let go of some of this stuff. And I get it. And that's why it's fine to maintain that lifestyle business. Last thing before we jump into the process kind of review here is strategic planning. So again, this isn't saying strategic planning is not important in the first couple stages. What's funny for many of you, are probably thinking, what's strategic planning? Well, for us as owners and consultants, it is about sitting down and setting targets on a yearly basis and communicating those targets, those initiatives to your team so that you can continue to grow. But in those first couple stages, it's not quite as critical because it's just you, it's a small group of people, and you're already thinking through some of those things. It's probably just not as formal as a strategic retreat or a formal document that highlights your strategic plan. But if you want to move into the later stages of, part of stage 3 and beyond, you're gonna have to put together a strategic plan. And if you're gonna start to do that, my advice would be don't do it by yourself. If you're an owner, get a few other people involved. Have somebody representing production. Have somebody representing sales, maybe accounting and finance. Because as you grow, you may be involved in a lot of areas, but you don't have the perspective that they have, right? Because you're not seeing the things that they see. And it's important to get that feedback as you put your plans together. Having this plan will also tremendously impact the value of your business. And the reason I say that is when I work with private equity groups and buyers, it gives them a lot of reassurance when they realize that your growth is coming from a place of intentionality, right? You're not just growing because, hey, the market was good this year, I jumped up 5%. Now your growth is because you're strategically adding a salesperson. You're doing a little bit more marketing. You've added a new service line. And when you document that, it goes a long way, and it will increase your value. As weird as it may sound for, a 3-page document. So now that I've gone through the stages, hopefully you're getting a better idea where you're at. Happy to talk to you guys afterwards more about the stages. Harvard Business Review has a full deck. I could do a whole class on that. But Todd's going to touch a little bit on the internal process versus the external process.
So there's really only 2 ways that a business can transition or be sold. And it's external, which is a competitor buys you, venture capital buys you, someone not involved in your business acquires you. Where Matt and I both came from was the internal process of having worked there, knowing the business, knowing the owner, and then coming through this whole transition process. And while the end is exactly the same, the company gets transitioned to ownership, how you get there and the emotions involved in that are completely different. So we're going to start talking through how to understand the transition process. First, you got to think, do you have anyone in the business that might be interested in buying the business? So you can determine, are you going to sell internal or external? The internal has a lot of challenges of its own. You have an employee, are they going to be able to come up with the capital? If not, are you willing to risk holding back a note so that maybe they can't get all the financing? You can hold back a couple $100,000, a couple million, and they're going to buy it off over time. How comfortable are you with that person that showed the interest in buying it, that you're willing to risk? Not only do they, if they have the ambition to do it, can they actually pull this off? Can they continue to run this business, grow it, so that you might be out and they're still paying you 5 years later? How comfortable are you doing it? If you're not, external will be the better way. But there's different challenges with external. It's going to happen substantially faster. They're going to come in, they're going to assess the business, you're going to go through the entire process, evaluation and all that, and then they're going to move quickly, and most likely, they're going to move you out quickly. So you need to be ready to exit your business maybe a little bit faster than you have thought. But then, if you do stay, they're going to take their branding, their styles, their systems, their processes, and change everything that you built. So you need to be comfortable with the baby you created is going to look totally different while you're still there. And can you let go of that control? Especially if you're company A, where you were so crucial to that business, and you've done everything, someone else is going to come in and do it differently than you did. So there's a lot of different issues with that. External, risk adverse, you don't have to worry about the capital. You see funding, you see everything else. It's more likely the sales going to go through. Other options are, there's businesses here that have recently sold, and they're kept on board. They've got an employment contract, and maybe they've got some stock in the overall umbrella company. So there's different synergies and different ways that you can stay on board if you just do not want to run the day-to-day. So the professionals that are going to be involved in this, and you need to invest in these, you're going to be talking with your tax accountants. You need to get with your financial advisors and have them walk you through what the sales process looks like as far as your taxes, how much money you need to live on, what you're going to be doing after. Your attorney is involved. Highly suggest advisors. One great thing about this industry is there are guys who specialize in this, and then there's guys that have been through it and they're willing to help you for free. I've never met an industry where so many guys are like, I've been there, done that, let me help you. This is by far the best industry I've ever seen in my life. So, with the internal process, there's a lot of different things involved, but if we just look at like 30,000 foot view really quick, there's really only 3 phases. You've got the planning phase, and realistically, the planning phase you can do in 30 to 90 days. This is high level stuff. This goes very, very quick. Depending upon where you're at, come up with initial values, which we'll walk you through stage by stage, you're going to get into a building phase. You might not be worth what you thought you were, and you need to stay in the business a little longer, grow it so that you can get that maximum value out so that you can sell for the dollar that you need to live on. And then the close phase. Closing is easy. There's a lot of little stages inside the close phase, but 60 days, it's done. So one area that I've seen a lot of owners screw up is the planning phase. So you got somebody interested in buying, and it's like, yep, I'm going to transition to you. You're going to be an owner someday. They pull this all up, and then a year goes by, 2 years go by. There's no documents, there's no plan. We haven't talked to anything, but yeah, you're going to get it. But son, we're going to transition to you. You're the future of the business. This can take 30 to 90 days. So this is something that Matt's going to touch on really quick of a deal he was in that he saw the writing on the wall that 30 to 90 days didn't happen.
Yeah, so this planning phase is not something that is super standard. This is something that Todd and I kind of worked out as we reflected on the deals that we've done. I mentioned I bought the company on Paradise Asphalt Payments. Great company, great experience. But prior to that, I had worked for several years with a concrete company. That's where I started, was in concrete. And the owner there was probably mid-60s. And he kept telling me, hey Matt, the vision here is for you to stick around. You're going to own this someday. 6 months would go by, a year would go by, kind of the same conversation, right? And what happened was, I think it was probably almost 2 years since the start. I worked there a lot longer, but since the start of those conversations, and I saw zero movement towards that, right? Like there was no hey, I'm going to help you understand the financials and learn the books or do any of those things. It was just kind of this carrot that we keep dangling. And, I made the hard decision that, hey, I gotta leave, I gotta go somewhere else, there's some other opportunities, which actually led me to Paradise. And a few years later, ended up taking that over. The point to this story, this isn't just my story, it's also that concrete owner's story. He is actually, even to this day, he subs my concrete work at Paradise, so I still know him. I have breakfast with him probably quarterly. We'll send him a fair amount of concrete work. And he shared with me it's probably almost a year after I'd left. He's like, Matt, I wish you would have stuck around. I wish, I don't have a plan. I don't know how I'm going to get out of this. And I felt bad for the guy, but at the end of the day, if you don't do this, you can't expect people to stick around forever. And then when I bought Paradise, he quickly realized, because he saw that owner exit, and Bob's done now, but he realized that could have been him had we had a plan. And so the whole reason Todd and I even put this into our presentation is for those of you that are maybe thinking about whether it's family or key team members on an internal sale, have a plan, start to build out some things that let those people know that they are going to move towards that. No one expects you to hand the keys to the kingdom over just like that, right? It's got to be gradual. But have a plan. Otherwise, especially I know Neil did class on millennials and the younger generation. You guys don't have to agree with it. I don't even want to get into that debate, but they won't stick around. And I think everybody in here knows they won't stick around because we see the turnover. So make sure you have a plan. I'll let Todd kind of walk you through some of these stages.
So the very first stage, we started zero. And this is really specifically for the owners of the company. And quick question is, if you're going to be starting this phase, what do you think the absolute first question, most important question is? You're going to be thinking about selling your business.
What's the value of the company? How do you get?
That's usually what people ask first. And a lot of owners go to that, what's my business worth? It really doesn't matter what the business is worth. How much money do you need? So it might be worth X, but if you need Y, this doesn't matter. So we need to start with, on the seller's end, is how much money do you need to get out of this business so that when you take this money, you're drawing down on it, you're investing it, you're getting dividends, you're living off this money. How much money do you need to live on is the very first question that we really need to ask, because if you need $250,000 a year and you sell it for X and you can only get an 8% return on that, you're pulling $100,000, you're not ready to sell, or you need to make a serious lifestyle change. So, one of the exercises we kind of put together was start with how much money do you need to live on? You're thinking about transitioning, thinking about selling. How much money do you need to live on from this business? You need $150,000 a year, you need $250,000 a year. You can take that number, and just say you're going to get a regular 8% rate. So we're going to take all that money, we're going to invest it, and we're going to live off the interest that we're going to make. So, owners out there, if you want to just take a quick second, think how much money you might need to live on. Figure an 8% return, and this is going to help us start planning for when we get to what the business is worth, to see if these two can kind of line up. So, quick example is, let's say I need $150,000 a year. I'm out of the business and I want to live on $150 grand. You're going to need to sell the business and net $1.875 million. So when we start talking about the value of the company, it has really nothing to do about the gross sales. That's great, you sell $10 million, the company might sell $6 million and actually net more cash than you do. The even playing field when we start talking about selling, or we talk about acquisitions, it's always EBITDA. And if you're not familiar with what EBITDA is, it's the earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So everything your account does to wipe out profit, you don't have to pay as many taxes. They start playing with the books. EBITDA is the true number of what this company actually is worth. And whether it's an external or an internal, that EBITDA number is going to be what drives the sales price of your business. So this is going to take care of, we say, eliminates the effects of financial and accounting decisions, depreciation, everything else. So the goal is to focus on the operating outcomes and operating decisions, so that you can drive that EBITDA number up. So if you're writing off your wife's car, her salary, it's bringing down the earnings the company's making, and it's also devaluing the company itself. So as we focus on EBITDA, everything we want to do is we want to drive that EBITDA number up. And if you don't know what EBITDA is, that's not a problem. You can text or email your account right now, and I'll get back to you in 15 minutes. Rely on your CPAs to tell you what this number is, and look back a couple of years and see, cool, I grew my sales from 6 million to 7.5 to 9 to 10. Your EBITDA might not have changed at all. So have them advise you what your EBITDA number is, and then we're going to use that number back into what it's worth, how to grow it so that you can maximize the value that you need. So now we're transitioning into stage one of phase one. This is the initial valuation. Now we can start asking that question, what's it worth? We know what we need to live on, and how much we need after we sell that business, how much we need to pocket every single year. We can start figuring out what it's worth. So if you guys happen to know your EBITDA number, write it down. A good conservative number for what you can sell that business for is 3 times what your EBITDA is. So let's say hypothetically, you've got $500,000 in EBITDA. You can multiply that number by 3. It's going to get you $1.5 million. The business is worth $1.5 million. But you're going to pay taxes. You're going to have everything else that you run through that business. You're probably going to pay the tax rate for a business owner probably going to be about 35%. So we're going to multiply the $1.5 million by 0.65. So if you take the EBITDA number, if you know it offhand, multiply it by 3, and then times it by 0.65. And then let's compare what you need to live on what do you think that business is worth for what it actually is? So let's say you need $250,000 to live on. The EBITDA number exercise that we did says that you can't sell the business for that. There's going to be that gap. It might be worth $1 million, and you need to sell it for $2 million. So you're short almost $1 million on that first slide.
Yeah, so I think one thing to keep in mind here too, guys, is these examples we're throwing out, this is not gospel. This is not written in stone, right? There are so many variables that come into play when we talk about what your EBITDA number is going to be, what adjustments we can make. I'll touch on that later. There's also different multipliers. So 3 is a nice conservative estimate. Just keep in mind, the higher your EBITDA is, the higher the multiplier is going to be. Because if you're a buyer, especially an external buyer, the more cash is there, the quicker they're willing to take kind of a longer ride, if you will, by increasing that multiplier. So I don't want anybody walking out of here thinking, oh, my company's definitely worth the 3X. It may or may not be. There's a lot of other things that come into play. This is simply for illustrative purposes. Your tax rates, I have no idea how you guys are depreciating your equipment. I have no idea where you're at from an income basis. So again, these are just examples to help you compare. But as Todd said, you have to think about the gap. And if there's a gap, you've got to adjust accordingly to bridge that gap. You've got to come up with a growth plan. You've got to go back to that strategic plan to figure out, how am I going to grow the company to this point? So one of the things we like to talk about is the emotions of this process. Because anybody can talk that has been through a deal about the logistical components, but having consulted with a lot of owners that have gone through a sale, there's a lot of emotions that come into play. You know, if there's not a gap when you did this calc, as a seller, you're already thinking about the future. Maybe you're excited about it. If there's a big gap, you're probably a little disappointed, right? Oh man, I thought I'd give you out the next 18 months. I guess I got to buckle down for another 3 years. So there's going to be some emotions that come with this as you jump into this journey. As a buyer, you're going to be excited to start to look at, okay, we're getting some real numbers to this. I now know what the owner needs. There's an incentive for that key team member on an internal sale to help grow it to that point so that they can make that transition. So from there, you really have to develop a plan to bridge that gap. And I'll let Todd talk a little more about that plan.
So if you go through the process and you realize that the business is short what you think you need to sell it for, bridging that gap is all about the plan that we can help you create. So let's say, based on the EBITDA, you pay your taxes, come out, initial value is you're going to $1 million. But the target is you need $2 million based on the 8% return that you're going to get. There's different ways that you can go about the transition process of having that key team member that's going to be buying the business. There's ways to give them. One option is if you have that key team member and you want to trust them to grow the business, you can always give them more money up front.
Yeah, so just a quick example of that, let's say there's $1 million gap. So what I would say is I would tell that key team member, let's grow the business by $1.5 million. And I know you guys are thinking, well, that puts you at 2.5. Sure, it puts you at 2.5, but in order for this guy to grow the business that he's gonna buy, there's gotta be some incentive there, right? Because why would I work as a key team member for 3, 4, 5 years to grow it to only pay more? I mean, how many of you in here, guys are thinking about maybe buying or transitioning would want that deal where you're gonna help somebody increase their value so that you get to pay more too? Having done it myself, it's crazy. You don't want to do that. So this is where you have to get creative. And this is just one of the many plans you can make. This is, again, just an illustrated example. But by making a plan, you're incentivizing that key team member. He's now getting a $2.5 million company for $2 million. And as an owner, you may be frustrated. Well, why on earth would I sell a $2.5 million company for $2 million? I'll tell you why. Because it wasn't $2 million until your key guy helped make it $2 million. That's why. I mean, simply put, if you were so confident, I'm not trying to be degrading to any owners, but if you're so confident it should have been worth $2 million, Why wasn't it worth $2 million over the 20, 30 years that had it? Right? It only got there because of the growth from those key acquisitions. So it's only, in my opinion, it's only fair to incentivize them for that growth. And the goal here is not to screw an owner or screw a buyer. The goal is to create a win-win. This gets the owner out at the value that he needs. It gets the buyer in a fair way. And then candidly, you can quickly make a plan B. The plan B in this example is that maybe you guys go through this and you've got a nice agreement in place with that key team member, but life happens over those 3 to 5 years, right? Maybe you can't get the capital. Maybe, God forbid, there's some illness in the family, whatever it may be, he may make up his mind, he doesn't want to buy it anymore. That's okay, because now we can sell it to an outside company. You're like, well, but that key guy grew it. Yeah, he did. We'll pay that key guy. He's not going to get the full $500,000 because now he's not buying it, but I'll throw him $400K, $420K, whatever it is, 80% of that growth for growing it. Again, as an owner, there's a contingency. You sell to an outside buyer. Your key guy's still happy. He doesn't feel like, he got taken advantage of for all those years by growing your business. He walks away with a pretty healthy payday. Yeah, he doesn't own a company. But I think most of us in here would be willing to put in 4 or 5 years of hard work to get this on top of our regular salary, right? So there's ways to structure it. I think the important piece is not to do this plan, but to think creatively about how you can come up with an agreement. Here you're going to start to see different emotions on both sides. I think the common one that Todd and I discussed is there's a little bit of anxiousness because now it's like, all right, we got this plan in place, like we have to do it. It feels real. The seller might be a little upset because, man, this plan's going to take a little while to execute. Most people don't want to wait. The buyer might feel upset because, well, this plan's going to take a little while to execute. And typically, you don't want to wait either. But if the incentives are there and it's structured in the right way, you can make it work. So before we move on from that plan and touch on stage 3, I just want to quickly look at some of the considerations that you should keep in mind. So for those that might be a little tough to read in the back, how will the buyer get the capital? Right? Because for some of us younger guys, unless you just come from a lot of money, it can be really tricky to come up with capital by that, especially an established business. So you have to consider as a buyer, maybe I need a partner, somebody to help out. You've got to consider as a seller, maybe there's some carryback, a note, something where the owner is going to self-finance. Maybe the buyer buys it over time. Maybe you let that buyer, instead of getting a bonus at the end of the year, he takes that bonus and it becomes just a little bit equity. Again, we got to take off that black and white thinking and start to find creative ways to make it happen. And there's people in this industry that can help you do that. Maybe there's more than one buyer. Maybe there's not a single guy in your company that can take it over. So you find 2 or 3, and they make a team, and they now probably are going to have a much better chance of getting the capital. These are the things you need to consider when you develop the plan. Do you need an advisor? Like Todd said, on an external deal, it's pretty common. On some of these internal deals, I don't see those advisors as often because of the relationships that exist. However, there's a lot of emotions involved. So sometimes having that moderator can help walk through this process. Quickly, as a buyer, why do you want to buy it? I think before we talk about any of these other considerations, you really have to ask yourself that question because it's going to be one of the biggest decisions you make, one of them in your life. As those of you that already own it, you guys know the stress and the worry and all that comes with running a company. So you really need to be confident on that why. Because if you're not, it's not going to work out. Hopefully in this build process that Todd's going to touch on, you can start to explore some of that. You should think about, is your family on board? Depending on your age, your status in life, are you married, do you have kids? What's that going to entail? Because it's going to be some late nights at the office, I promise you. Again, should you consider a partner? What's your plan for growth? And that's important because that ties into the last one. You You don't want to buy it just to maintain it, right? Because there's going to be too much debt to pay off. You've got to grow it so that you can both pay off that debt and hopefully make a little money. Because if you're going to own a company and go through all the stress and headaches that sometimes entails, you want to make a profit from it. So think about how you're going to grow it. Think about what else you need to invest into it. And this is one, I'll be honest, I don't want to speak for Todd, but I kind of learned this lesson the hard way. You know, I knew what equipment we had when I bought it. I don't think I fully took the calculation into effect of like, those 2 skid steers are going to have to be replaced in the first year that I purchased the company. That paver's already got 2,500 hours on it, right? Those trucks, they're getting up there. So make sure you're thinking about what additional investments you might have in a company and work out the deal accordingly, because for most of us, you're going to be so leveraged to acquire it, you may not have that credit to go replace those key pieces of equipment. So those are all considerations.
One of the things I learned the hard way was when I bought 50% of the company to start with. The deal took 2 weeks. It was literally a handshake. It was the easiest thing I ever done in my life. I got a hell of a deal in the business. Wasn't very profitable, which is why I was looking to sell. Nobody from the business was interested in buying it. So I buy a business that's about to break even, start making some money. We added technologies and systems, processes, and it grew really quick the first year. And I'm looking at some good distributions, and then the paver that was old, very well maintained, everything that they had, all the equipment. I didn't realize how an added stress of doing 30% more work would tank all that equipment. So instead of taking distributions and making the company profitable, we didn't have the cash to buy those equipment. So we took on more debt. More and more things as I looked into it and realized the company's going to need continued investment into equipment. We started outgrowing the shop, we started growing everything. Every time we just got to that point where we're starting to make a lot of money, we had to throw money back into the business. And that's something I didn't prepare for or think through when I bought the business. I can't stress enough getting your family on board on this. My wife, even to this day, kind of jokes, "Go do something? Oh, we can't do that. You bought a paving company." And it's like, yes, we do. But things we turned around, company's doing great. We're able to have a better lifestyle than we did before. She's on board. The stress of owning a business is definitely something that she wasn't used to for the other business that we did. So now it's time to formulate the plan. And this is where you guys really need to get together and start talking about what's a win-win. If you're going to do an internal sale, you might not be pulling every single dime out of this company because you want to see your legacy go on, whether it's with the kids or it's someone else. This has to be a win-win. Neither side can screw either. So things that you've got to start considering is how long are you going to give your key team member to get financing? If you're going to start tying the company up and go with an internal sale, start talking about what type of period he has so that you're not stretching this out a year and you find out that you can never secure the financing. You're going to give a discount, like we talked about, for growing the business. How long is that going to last? So when we had our plan, it was I'm going to grow the business and I'm going to get a discount on what I built it from. The problem I made when I bought the second half was I didn't make that discount large enough. I grew the business 4 times over in the first 4 years. All I did was make it 10 times more expensive to buy out that second piece. So I could have saved hundreds of thousands of dollars for the work that I put in. My owner was a little more hands-off and was loving that I was taking on the day-to-day, growing the business. His salary increased, his debt decreased, but all I did was make it more expensive for me to buy. So getting that discount or that incentive, figuring out how long do you want to do this. If this is a 3-year plan and he doesn't hit the metrics that you need to get at, what are you guys looking at making that time period? There's going to be a lot of costs involved as you go through the transition process. There's going to be valuations, there's going to be attorney's fees, and everything else to get to this point. Are you the buyer absorbing all of that? Is the business going to absorb it, or are you guys going to split it? The best thing about this whole plan is don't overthink it. We're talking about high-level numbers, time frames, so that everybody can hold everybody accountable to, so we do not end up like the situation Matt was in, where that owner's still working. His lot that he bought out is sitting on a beach somewhere. So if you can make this final agreement for the purchase, we don't have to get everything involved, but at least get time frames so that everybody's on the same page and everybody can control. The one thing that I never realized was going to happen, and I started talking to Matt, and he went through the same exact experience, which is why we kind of do these emotions on here. I turned into a therapist for my buyer, for the seller, sorry. I didn't realize that he was going to go through such a difficult transition period. This was his baby. He started for 40 years. He had no identity other than his business. He was a business owner. He grew his paving company. No hobbies, really no friends. And as the business started to transition, the swing of emotions happened that I wasn't ready for. And it's funny that Matt, the seller, had the exact same issue of, I'm a paver. What do I do if I don't have this business? What do I do if I don't have the control? I'm the guy that makes the decisions. The ego gets hit, and they go through a slew of emotions, which is why we just wanted to kind of point out what you're going to be going through, because as we run this through with other businesses that do the same thing, it's the same exact emotions that you're going through. So the more you can be prepared for these emotions, the better you're going to be able to navigate and communicate with each other. So the sellers believe that there's finally a plan. We're back on track. He can start thinking about what retirement looks like again. Remembers what we need it to be. The buyer's excited because there's a plan. Maybe you've been strung out for a year or two, and you've been promised this is going to happen. There's finally a plan, a high-level agreement, there's time frames when your owner is going to exit. But you're going to be excited if you want to get to work. It's time to grow that business and start getting ready for the transition. So as we've gone through, we finished the first 3 stages of planning, and now it's to get to the build stage. So this is the gap in how we're going to get there and what you're going to do. And this gives the buyer that opportunity to start growing that business, perhaps running it maybe his way. This is maybe new technology, marketing automation, everything else that he's dreamed about if this company was mine. So as we go into the build phase, this can take anywhere from 1 year, 5 years, depending on how big that gap is or how long the seller wants to stay in the business. This is everything why we're at NPE. We've taken classes on job costing. We've taken classes on managing millennials. We've talked about systems, processes. We've got taken sales classes, culture. I think this industry has maybe been 15 years behind the time in what the culture should be for a company. And that can be a big shock between a 65-year-old owner and a 30-year-old owner of how they want to run things. So depending upon how long you have to start growing that business during this gap time, this is when you start going hot and heavy on building repeatable systems, building your marketing plan, building a bench. So as that company is getting ready to transition, you've probably got some older employees as well. If they leave the business and retire, which is going to be a mass retirement in the next 3 to 7 years, how are you going to start building a bench? We know we can't just take a sales guy or an operator and throw them on a machine they're going to pick up. It's going to take a year or two to ramp them up. This is your time to start investing and training the next generation to figure out who your next rock stars are going to be. So as you can take this time, start thinking through how are you going to start building a leadership team? How, as the seller as well, how are you going to start doing more and more of this so that the team that you're creating can lead and you can start figuring out all your processes, get all your ducks in a row. And like we said, this can take anywhere from 1 to 5 years. Mine took about 4.5, and the emotion piece is what almost killed the whole thing. So my owner started to do more and more of this. I started taking more and more of the reins, but then we started fighting. I wanted to start doing a whole lot more concrete. He's like, hey, let's not rock the boat. We've got this plan. What if we tank it? What if this doesn't turn out right and we devalue it? So he would put a lot of risk on what I could do to grow the business, not only top line, but grow that EBITDA number. He didn't want to take any risks. And I'm like, but I'm getting incentivized to grow this business so that you can exit it. We started having some issues where we weren't communicating well. This is the most crucial thing that can screw up relationships between fathers and sons, daughters and mothers. Your key team members, your leadership team, if you guys are not 100% on board communicating to what are acceptable risks, because the new guy, he's going to want to grow it because he's getting a discount. I'm going to grow this thing and I'm not going to penalize myself for the hard work. But the seller's going to want to maximize the value and play it safe. He knows what he needs. Let's just hit this number, write it out of it. The sellers can sometimes appear a little inactive because the kid's running in, he's putting in the energy, he's taking the day-to-day, you're able to step back a little bit. My arguments that I ended up getting into was, why am I putting in all the work? I need you to come along with me. I'm trying to feel like I'm dragging my buyer, my seller, to come with me on this journey. But on the flip side, I felt underappreciated. He felt like he didn't have a place anymore. And because we weren't communicating and talking, it started to cause some issues. Once we figured out that we are at two different spots, what our end results are, yes, we want to end up with the transition, but how we get there was totally different. Once we sat down and had a little come to Jesus with each other, everything was fixed. We started meeting every week, just have coffee outside the office, and just talk about, where's your head at, where's my head at, how are we going to do this? And it made the transition process so much easier. But had we not stopped and said, why are we going like this? It could kill the whole deal. And now we're great friends. I was 32 when I bought the company, was 72. So there was a huge gap just in life experiences, a whole different gap in how I see the future versus what he wants to do. But being able to come together with these goals and communicate each step of the way, Todd, one of my best friends, is 72 years old, but it works. So please be aware of all the emotions that come through this. So the thing you need to remember is that we're going to move away from being dependent on the owner. You're going to start maximizing value as you make decisions. You're not going to invest unwisely. You're going to think what can grow that EBITDA number, what can grow the value, not make unwise expenses. You start to talk about ideal timelines as you invest. So am I going to put down money to buy a milling machine, which is going to create maybe some debt, bring the value down, but we know we can make more money? Is this the time to do it, or do you want to do that down the road? Sellers, biggest thing we can tell you is don't check out too early. Don't already be in retirement mode. Get involved, help them grow the business, because you're going to ultimately reap the benefits at the end. Not just leave it up to them and then be all pissed off that they did it their way. You guys need to communicate together. The biggest thing that I would recommend if you're going to be buying the company, you can't tackle everything. Pick a few things and say, hey, I want to do a list of 12 things that I want to do with this company, so I've been thinking about it forever and I worked here. Pick 3. If you get 3 of these things done during this build stage, you're way ahead of the game. I can't freaking everything. We're going to do marketing, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. All I did was stress myself out. We grew like crazy. But I could have done it much easier and a lot less stressful.
Yeah, and I think on the build stage, guys, you could do a class, spend 90 minutes easy just on that slide. So in your handouts, one of the few things that are in there, all the points Todd touched on, there's a little bit more information. There's a lot of classes here that can help you learn about marketing. I know Brandon Stan's teaching some. There's a lot of processes. We did job costing yesterday. So those are all things to keep in mind. For the sake of time, I'm going to move through the rest of this internal pretty quickly so we can touch on external and then see if there's any questions. But as you get done with the planning phase and that build phase, you're going to enter this close phase. In this closed phase, you'll hear me talk. I know we've been focused on internal. That's what Todd and I did. A lot of this also applies to an external sale as well. So you may hear me kind of make mention of external buyers, things like that. So now we're back to valuation. We think we're through the build stage. We think we've hit the number. This confirms, did we hit the number? Are we truly ready? And on that point, you have to think about how you're going to get that valuation. Especially on an external sale, but possibly even on an internal, I highly recommend you get with your bank or an advisor, ideally a CPA, which those credentials is just, they're certified to do valuations. Things to consider here are the types of valuations. There's different types, income-based, asset-based, market-based, so take that into account as you're looking at that valuation number. The biggest thing, and Todd touched on this a little bit, but this is where advisors can really help. And this can apply to an internal, but especially on an external sale. EBITDA adjustments. If you're going to sell, think about EBITDA adjustments. Those are the things Todd mentioned. The first type is your personal expenses. I'm sure there's at least one of you in here that's running something through the company that's personal, right? I mean, we all do it. There's nothing wrong with it from a tax standpoint. It's great. But if you work with an advisor or CPA, when you present to your buyer, you can add that back. So let's say you spend $100,000 on personal expenses and your EBITDA is $900,000. When we go to market, we're going to say your EBITDA is $1 million because that buyer, especially an external, may not have these personal expenses. So that's all part of the earnings. Those personal expenses are pretty easy adjustments to get through the due diligence phase, which we'll touch on next. Ones that can be a little harder are those one-off expenses. An example of a one-off expense is I worked with a company, they hired a recruiter. You know, it's hard to staff right now, right? It's hard to find people. So this company got a recruiter. A little interesting how he was paid. It wasn't percent of salary or all those things we're used to. He was a flat fee, I think it was $5,000 a month. The company had him for about 2 months. And he did all this work, he brought a lot of candidates. The guy they ended up hiring actually came from a competitor and reached out directly to the owner. Well, guess what? They still had to pay that recruiter $10,000. And that's an expense that hit. But if you're going to sell, there's a strong case to be made, right? That, hey, we don't typically spend $10K on a recruiter. And an even stronger case to be made that, hey, it didn't actually produce any results. The buyer won't have to use that recruiter, so we try and add those one-time expenses back in. The goal here, especially on the seller side, and this is where I might be bouncing a little bit to externals, to help you guys raise that EBITDA number so that you can get the maximum value for your business. The last type of EBITDA adjustment is the hardest type to get through due diligence. And due diligence is when you have your accounting companies come in and really validate your earnings. But that type is normalization. So normalization, an example of normalization would be a company I worked with hired a CFO. Their books were a mess, everything was just a disaster. The bookkeeper they had was sticking invoices in drawers and not coding them to the right accounts. So they had this CFO, I would say she was probably making $125,000, $130,000. High-powered CFO. She stayed with the company about 18 months, 2 years, kind of got it cleaned up, and she got kind of bored. Because as a lot of us know, once it's built well, you don't necessarily need that high-powered accounting person for a lot of our paving or steel coat companies. So they hired a controller or a bookkeeper. I think they paid her about, depends on your market, right, but 75, 80K. So quickly now, we work to normalize that expense. We said, hey, that controller, you know, because they're going to look at 3 years financials typically. So we tried to take that 120, let's say, down to 80. That normalization is probably the hardest thing to get through. I've had one client out in California, a gentleman they brought on to run their concrete division, did a big concrete job. They were supposed to make like 50 grand of profit on the thing. It was a nice concrete job. For whatever reason, he didn't know what he was doing. Ended up losing about 30 grand. I'm not saying like 30 from the 50, I'm saying like $80,000 swing, right? Like the job cost them money. You were in my job costing class yesterday, that should never happen. But when we went to sell that company, we talked to the buyer and we said, hey, this guy's no longer here. It was kind of a one-off thing, but we normalized out that revenue and that income. And in this case, they allowed it to go through. Normalization, those adjustments to EBITDA are probably the hardest to get through. As you go through this valuation stage, and we keep talking about these emotions, the seller's going to start to get probably a little tired, right? Because it's been a long process to get through that planning phase, that build phase. But yet they're starting to get a little bit more anxious or a little more excited because they can maybe see the end in sight. The buyer's definitely excited because if that valuation comes back right, he knows that that build phase is over, and he can start to see the light at the end of the tunnel as well. Then we go into due diligence. Due due diligence varies between an internal sale and an external sale, but I would recommend it no matter what. On an external sale, especially with your private equity, and we'll get to that in a minute, they're going to have the big accounting firms come in. They're going to spend tens of thousands of dollars to look through your books, make sure no one's cooking anything and they are what they are. On an internal sale, that's probably not as necessary because if you followed the plan that Todd laid out, you did it right. You as an internal buyer should be very familiar with the books. You should know what the P&L looks like. You should know where the balance sheet's at. And if you don't, you did something wrong in that build phase. And you need to work with your owner to learn those components of the business because they are critical components of the business. You don't want to buy a company and then not understand its financials. Again, due diligence can vary on the time it takes. Depends on the firm. Could be 30 days, could be 60 days. A lot of it depends more on the seller and how quick you can get the information. They're going to request a laundry list of information. And the quicker you get that to them, the quicker they'll complete that process. You have a high-powered accounting person. They're a great person to bring into the transition team. If you don't, your CPA, tax accountants, things like that can also help. Emotions on this is where we start to really see some tension, right? Because maybe the numbers don't hold up quite as well, and the seller starts to get a little defensive. He's getting kind of tired. I think you've had examples where they even start to kind of shut it down a little bit. And that's normal. And part of why we put this up here is this is normal in the process. The buyers can start to feel like, man, these adjustments are just nickel and diming me, and the EBITDA is not really what it said it was. Moving through a little quicker here, we have agreements. Again, on an internal sale, this will be much easier. On an external sale, it's a bit more complicated. And you want to guess why it's complicated? Anybody think there's a reason why the agreements are complicated? Attorneys, just that attorneys make it complicated. That's just how it is. It's attorney time and they love those billable hours. And it's even worse when you have two attorneys fighting back and forth. You notice I didn't just say agreement. There is an asset purchase agreement typically, but there's also employment agreements, non-disclosure agreements. Depending on the deal, there could be a lot of different agreements at this point. Things to consider as you look at these agreements and you're working with your attorneys. How long are you going to require that seller or that owner to stay on? I think, Todd, from your experience, you would say the shorter the better?
Yeah, because we had those coffees and we had such a great relationship, my partner, I want to stay on for 5 years. He's like, this is great. I'm like, yeah, absolutely, this is great. I got the old owner who wants to stay around and knows the business as good as I do. It started to change pretty quick when this company went polar opposite to what he had always done. He started feeling out of place. He was wondering why he wasn't on the leadership team. We were growing for the future and a lot of tension. So I'm not saying anything against the sellers, but it's time to retire. If you're going to do this, let the next generation go. It's time to move on.
I would agree. The shorter the timeline, typically the better. There are situations with earn-outs, things like that, where the owner or the seller is going to have to stay on longer. Hopefully, it's mutually beneficial in those situations, but it's a hard journey. Focus on the details. Make sure you understand if there's money being held back in escrow for a true-up. Maybe there's money on an earn-out, so you're getting 80% of your buyout right out of the gate, but on an external sale, they want you to hit a certain number in your first year or two, and they'll give you the rest. These are all common things. We can answer more questions. It's hard to cover every variable because of the vast amount of variables in deals like this. Now you have the transition plan. I think the transition plan is best summed up as a communication plan. When do I communicate what to my team? On an internal sale, this should be relatively easy because hopefully whoever's buying it from the inside is well respected and hopefully someone liked within the company. If not, you might want to rethink that internal transition. On an external sale, can be very tricky. Some companies I work with want to tell their teams too early. and some wait until everything's done and closed, and maybe you could argue till too late. I find that it's important to bring a couple key team members in a little bit earlier. Sometimes we even have them sign NDAs, so the rest of the team doesn't come aware of it, because as you guys know, people like to talk. I would work on focusing on what's important to the people you're telling it to. A lot of owners that sell want to tell their story and defend their decision. And, I built this legacy and I'm ready to get out. Let's be honest, most of your team members, while they care more about how is it going to impact them. Does my health insurance change? Am I getting paid the same? Am I getting a raise? That'd be great. Right? Think about the questions they're going to ask. Maybe even prepare an FAQ sheet so that you're ready for that transition. I would not do this until you're confident in agreements. A lot of these deals don't always make it all the way through. So think through that communication plan. As a seller, I'm not going to touch on the identity issues. I think Todd covered that pretty well. But thank you. I think you start to realize, what am I going to do next? I've been Mr. Pavement for 30 years, and now I'm John Doe. It's an identity shift. And if you think it's not, you're like, I can't wait to leave these headaches behind, I'm going to go fishing. Yeah, you will, and you'll love it for the first 3 to 6 months. But then you'll wake up, and I'm kind of bored, depending on your age, things like that. So think about the routines, the habits you're going to put in place. For the buyer, you're thinking about, hey, is this team going to follow me? If you're starting to worry, it kind of hits you at this point, right? Like the agreements are there, you've got a transition plan, and now you're starting to think like an owner. I've got good news and bad news. The good news is a lot of that overthinking is wasted, right? They're not going to all leave you. The whole company is not going to quit tomorrow. You're worried about things that probably aren't going to happen. That's the good news. The bad news is get used to worrying about a lot of stuff. Because you're now a business owner, and that's unfortunately part of it. Closing is pretty simple. It's putting your John Hancock on those papers. The agreements are good. This is simply, and this isn't typically at the time of the agreements. The agreements go back and forth. You'll have a set close date. There'll be a wire for the funds. You'll sign the papers. If everything's done well, this is a pretty easy stage. Everybody's pretty excited. I would, we say time to celebrate. I truly would recommend celebrating, whether that's a bottle of champagne or a few cigars, whatever that looks like for you. You just went through a very long and difficult process, so celebrate it. As a buyer, you're going to be excited. But you're also going to be a little lost on where to start. Technically, 9 is much like 0, not a true step in the process, but it is, because as we said, the seller has to think about his next chapter. And it's great that he's able to think about that next chapter, but it is definitely the next chapter. And as a buyer, you're really jumping back to that build phase. Now you're doing it as the owner. So, as great as it is to get through this process, and as tired as you may be, it's time to get to work. Unfortunately, you don't have the luxury of taking a break and kind of recovering after that long process. You've got to get to it. You know how the debt load, you've got to pay some money to make. So that's the internal process in a nutshell. I think briefly I want to touch on the external. The reason I want to touch on the external is, I would say, I always hear 1 out of 10 external deals go all the way through. I don't have numbers on internal because it's private. I would think it's probably even fewer than that. So the reason external is important, we unfortunately don't have time to get too in depth, but it gives you a nice backup plan if the internal deal doesn't work. I'm going to focus on the internal journey because that's the one that both of us went on, but it's not the only path. Sorry, I'm trying to go pretty quick here. On an external sale, you're going to have 3 different types of buyers. You're going to have an individual buyer, a competitor, and private equity. The individual buyer, actually, a company I consulted with, sold to a guy that owned a bunch of convenience stores. I don't know what made him think he wanted to get into patching and seal coat, but he did, and he bought it. Those guys are going to either be self-financed or maybe work with the bank. Competitors, another type of buyer. Obviously, it makes sense. Your competitor might be able to gain some market share. Maybe they do concrete and want to get into asphalt. Very logical buyer on an external sale. The third and final type is private equity, and this is one that you're seeing, if you're not seeing, you will see, I promise you, a lot more in our space. Private equity are the groups right now that there's a lot of money in the market, and this industry hasn't really seen much roll-up. And so you're starting to see, I'm sure a lot of you know companies in here that have private equity behind them. You may not realize they have private equity behind them, but there's some companies at the national level that are tied to that. And to understand private equity without going into too much detail is that they focus on acquiring typically as many companies as they can or growing that EBITDA, and they're not going to hold it for decades. They're going to hold it for 5, 6, 3, 7 years, and then they're going to sell it to somebody else. And if you remember what I said about EBITDA, the higher the EBITDA, the higher the multiplier. So it's this weird financial game where they make a lot of money by buying 10 guys, grouping them together. That EBITDA number just went up by 10. So they get a higher multiplier, and they get more money. But they are a very legitimate buyer, and in this market can be a very realistic purchaser for your business. This is the external sales process. It's going to look very similar to what Todd and I ran through, especially from about due diligence on. The difference here is this section, right? And I'll be happy to answer questions after the fact on external sales. But the difference is you're going to want to build a story for your company, a prospectus, a deck. It's going to be confidential, but you want to highlight your team, your processes, your financials, because then you can take it to multiple buyers. And the reason you take it to multiple buyers is so you can get more offers. It's kind of like selling a house, right? It's always great to sell a house when you got 8, 10, 12 offers. And this last, this housing boom we've been in, that's kind of been the case. I don't know the markets you're in, but at least the ones that I'm familiar with. So you want to build a story. You want to do it yourself or work with an advisor to take it to multiple buyers. And you want to look at a letter of intent. A letter of intent is more or less that offer on the house. It's going to tell you the conditions that they have in their proposed purchase. So those conditions could be much like a 100% cash, could be a cash offer. Those are great, right? Don't have to worry about the banks. It could be 80% cash, 20% earn out, 20% note. There's different ways they can structure these deals. It could be a case where they want to rebrand you and remove some of your team, and that's hard for a lot of owners. But it could also be a case where they're going to leave everything alone. They just want to see, fairly aggressive growth year over year, and they let you be. It's important to understand this external process, because if you don't go down the internal path, again, key team members here can add a lot of value, and then they ride along for the journey of that external sale. So there's lots of lessons learned, I think, on Todd and I's stories. My story of the concrete company, have a plan, communicate to your people, don't just assume the guys are going to stick around for the ride forever. Try not to make the same mistakes we did. And one of the best ways to do that is reach out to other people that have done it. There's a lot of people that you guys know even in this industry that have recently sold a business. As Todd said, if you don't know any, you're going to real soon, because a lot of people are going to start to look to retire. So to recap, we want to identify what stage our business is in. You can't get to where you're going if you don't know where you're starting. You want to maximize its value. Now look through some of these examples on culture and vision, building a leadership team. Go to classes, go listen to some of the other speakers here to learn the best practices to maximize the value of your company. And then understand the transition process. We spent a lot of time on the transition process, and I think the reason why is by knowing what to expect, A, you'll be able to maximize your value, but B, that 1 in 10, that 1 in 20, the odds go up substantially because you're not going to quit when it gets hard. You're going to kind of know some of those psychological components that come with that. And then learn from others. Don't make the same mistakes that others have done. We had a lot of successes as well, but I think there's things that everybody would always do different. I know we're short on time. If you have any questions, Todd and I'll stick around. You can email us, connect with us on LinkedIn. We'll have some business cards. Happy to send you guys a PDF of all of these slides, as well as we have some stuff in the appendix that will think they're hidden, but just touch more on how you maximize that value. So if you want a PDF of this presentation, please come up, let us know. Feel free to email, reach out. We appreciate the time. Thank you for coming.